Hero, instead of starting today's episode with a thought experiment, I'm just going to tell you the purpose of today's show is to ask the biggest questions I can to one of the wisest teachers and perhaps most compassionate Jewish leaders that I know. Questions like, who is God? What should people who aren't Jewish know about Judaism? And this one, why be Jewish?
Oh, I have an idiosyncratic answer for that.
I'm counting on it. This man has taught me a lot, has taught my teachers a lot. And today, it feels super duper to think about all he's going to teach you, too. Hey, DJ, let's make like the ancient pyramid builders and start with the base.
Welcome to the Jewcurious Show, where learning about Judaism and getting to know Jewish people can help you live a life of meaning, joy, human connection, and personal growth. And now your host, Rabbi John Carrier.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Joey. Thank you, Hadar Ensemble. A show could do worse for a house band. Yes, no, maybe so. That music makes me want to get up into my time machine, only I'm not going to 1955 with Marty McFly. I'm going to the summer of 1999 when I first read It's a Mitzvah by Rabbi Bradley Shavit Artson for my own Intro to Judaism class. This is the first Jewish book besides, we'll say, the Torah that I ever read. Back in the machine, fast forward 8.5 years, and I'm sitting in the office of its author because I'm being interviewed for admissions to the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies in Los Angeles, where he's the dean of the school. To be clear, this is the author of the first Jewish book I ever read interviewing me for rabbinical school that he's in charge of. It's like the ultimate exam on that book. Now, as I was preparing for this admissions interview, I spoke to a number of other people at the school before I get to the dean, and I mentioned this book that I'd read called The New Rabbi by Stephen Fried. This is a journalist who spent some time in a synagogue that was in the rabbinic search process. There's a lot of inside baseball about synagogue board politics and the inner workings and bureaucracies of my denomination. And it's got a lot of editorial content that is, we'll say, unkind to Rabbi Artson and to people in our profession and to people in the North American Jewish community, kind of folded into the narrative. And so when I mentioned to people that I was reading this book, everybody said, don't tell Rabbi Artson that you're reading this book. And I said, why not? And they said, just trust me on this one. So after I talked to all these rabbis and these teachers, and my last meeting is in Rabbi Artson's office with me and him alone. And the first question he asked me is, do you have any questions so far? And so the first question I asked him, of course, was, why is everybody telling me not to tell you that I read this book? And he told me what he thought of the book and its good points and its bad points. But what he didn't do was become nonplussed that I had asked the question. And postscript, I, several years later, graduated from that school. My point is that this story reflects the best of what I see and the best of what other people see in Judaism and in rabbis, that you get to ask questions. And that if you have a rabbi of the right temperament, no question is, shall we say, out of bounds. And in my experience with today's guest, no question has ever been out of bounds. And he's always answered those questions with humanity, with frankness, but with dignity. And from that day to this, it's been my pleasure to get to know him as a teacher, as a leader, as a boss for a bit when I was working at the American Jewish University as a student, and now it's super exciting for me to be able to share him with you as well. And you'll see that whatever questions I ask, he answers with dignity, with humanity, and with wisdom. But I don't want to bias you just yet. You'll just have to hear for yourself. But before we get started, before you set your phone aside, before you put it in your pocket, so that you can relax and listen to this whole episode while you're washing the dishes, walking the dog, driving on your commute. Before you settle in, I want you to take just a moment, if you haven't done so already, and hit the subscribe button. And that way, you'll make sure that every episode of this show that comes out weekly, you'll be able to download automagically into your podcast listening device. And we can keep learning together with all the guests that I bring on the Jewcurious show. But now, without further introduction, delay, obfuscation, or defenestration, my teacher, and I hope yours, Rabbi Brad Artson. All right, friends, coming to the microphone. It is my great honor and humble pleasure to introduce to you one of my teachers, one of my teacher's teachers, and for my money and for a lot of other people, is one of the greatest rabbis working and teaching today. And he is Rabbi Dr. Bradley Shavit Artson, the Rosalind and Abner Goldstein Dean of the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies of American Jewish University here in beautiful Los Angeles, California, and also the dean of the Zechariah Frankel College, which trains rabbis in Europe. He is bicontinental, and he is also a mensch. Rabbi Artson, welcome to the Jewcurious podcast.
Thank you. Happy to be with you.
I'm delighted that you're here. I'm delighted, most of all, just always great to have a conversation with you, but I'm also really excited to share what you have to say with my audience of Jewcurious people, we'll call them, people who are listening to this for a number of different reasons. But first, I want to get to know you. I know that you are a rabbi professionally. I've seen you in your office wearing a tie. Presumably that's what you do for a living. Are you a rabbi at home too?
Well, let me elevate that a little bit.
Okay.
It's not much am I a rabbi at home, but loving God and loving Torah isn't just my job. In other words, I took this job because that's what I do all the time. And I try to seek and serve God and seek and serve other people. But let me tell you a good story of how those came together. Mm-hmm. A couple years ago, my wife's family are Israeli, and her nephew wanted to improve his English. So he asked me to help him get a job at a Jewish summer camp in Southern California, Camp Ramah in Ojai. Mm-hmm. And I was able to help him do that. And so he came here, and like all staff for Camp Ramah, he had to put on Tefillin in the morning. Tefillin are the leather boxes that the Torah inscribes with verses from the book of Deuteronomy and tells us to wear on our foreheads and around our arms. And traditional Jews have been putting them on every morning from time immemorial. Mm-hmm. So he had a pair that he had been given at his bar mitzvah that he hadn't used since then. Okay. Since he's a fairly secular Israeli. And he came here to learn how to do it. And so he was in my study, and I was helping him learn how to do it. And it was going badly. These were killer tefillin. They were trying to strangle him and wrestle him to the ground. And I kept having to save him from these tefillin. And
if I think I'm going to have to put a picture of these in the show notes for people who haven't seen these before, but go on, because they are a little scary sometimes if you don't know what you're doing.
They can be. So meanwhile, I have a young adult son, Jacob, who has pretty severe autism and has been struggling heroically with it his whole life. An amazing young man. Jacob is watching as his cousin is floundering with these tefillin, and finally can't take it anymore. And he pulls out a buddy board, which is a little keyboard that he types on and communicates by typing. Mm-hmm. And he types, "Roe, you're so lucky to be able to put on tefillin. I want to, but I can't." And of course, that breaks my heart. You know, my son, who loves Torah more than anyone I know, and who says that it saved his life, wants to fulfill this ancient mitzvah and can't. So I say to him, Jacob, I have to tell you, in Jewish tradition, someone who wants to do a commandment and can't do it gets the credit for doing it. So in God's eyes, you've been putting on your tefillin every day since your bar mitzvah. But that's not good enough. So what we're going to start doing from now on is I'm going to wrap the tefillin on my arm, and you're going to say the blessing, and I'll say amen. And then I'm going to wrap it around my head, and then you'll say the blessing, and I'll say amen. And at the beginning, I'll take the talit, the prayer shawl, and you and I will hug each other, and I'll wrap it over our heads, and you'll say the blessing. So I've been doing that almost every morning since then, which was about 3-4 years ago. Every morning, I get a hug from my son, and he says the blessings, and I physically do the commandment, and that way we share the mitzvah.
Wow.
And I think that's really a powerful symbol of what it's really all about. It's about sharing love and sharing holiness and making room for people to be able to connect to it as best they can.
That's a beautiful story on a number of different levels. First, just fathers and sons stories, which I relate to, struggle with, but always enjoy. But I think it's also a powerful story for many people who are listening to this show. God willing, many people are listening to this show who are coming to Judaism from, I'll say, not the center, not the easy door in, but maybe coming to it for the first time as an adult, or coming back to it for the first time as an adult, or people who are just, for whatever reason, that main front door doesn't fit them.
Right.
And I've talked to a lot of people like this, and the frustration is heartbreaking. The idea of, am I doing this right? If I make a mistake, am I blowing up the whole thing? And the imposter syndrome that some people deal with, that if I'm not doing everything perfectly, I'm not legitimately in this space and I don't belong here.
Rabbi Carrier, let me just remind you, and also share with those who have joined us, that I grew up in an anti-religious home.
Okay.
So I wasn't at all traditional growing up. I was an atheist, and we did not keep kosher, did not observe the Sabbath. I didn't even go to synagogue most Yom Kippur. So all of this is practices and teachings that I've grown into as an adult. I literally had a conversionary experience in everything but label, meaning my label was always Jew, but I became a religious Jew, a spiritual Jew in college. I've shown people the first Jewish book I read was an anthology of rabbinic teachings, and I wrote in the inside front cover Hebrew words I didn't know. So I wrote the word Torah, and I wrote the word teshuvah. It really was a blank slate. And so I guess what I would want to invite you and me and your listeners to is, there are some people who grow up with it, and it's just part of their literally mother's milk, and it's the rhythm of their entire life. And that's both a blessing and a burden. The blessing is they have an intuitive knowledge that's just part of who they are. But the downside is they have a lot of bad experiences they need to clean up. Or a lot of bad Hebrew school, or bad rabbiing, or they just were adolescents, so they weren't really paying attention. It becomes like a piece of paper on which you've written and erased and written and erased. It has blotches.
Gotcha.
For those of us who come to it as an adult, we'll never have the kind of second nature facility that someone who had it from birth has. But what we have is the joy of self-discovery and of a clean new piece of paper on which we take these notes so they sparkle and they shine. The Judaism that I discovered as an adult is powerful and brilliant and electric and loving. And I don't have any bad childhood experiences to erase. So that's also a benefit, because it means we can connect to the larger world who didn't have the benefit and burden of a traditional childhood.
That's powerful. No, that's awesome. Thank you for that. But I had a non-traditional Jewish upbringing as well. I was actually in a pretty pro-religious household, just not this one. So, And my conversionary experience came somewhat after college. But I think that's something that I try to teach people as well, is that, look, a lot of the times the imposter syndrome comes from a place that everybody else is legitimate and feels that way, and you're the only one who's different.
Right.
Right. And that feeling goes away most rapidly when you realize that everybody is just as scared as you, or everyone is just as fresh as you.
We're all imposters.
Right.
Being an imposter isn't good or bad. You just can't let that get in the way.
Say more about that.
Well, we're all faking it, we're all babies here in this ancient tradition that's thousands of years old. The oldest of us is 100.
Okay.
So we're all kids, and we're all trying our best, and we're also living it in an unprecedented situation. Judaism that developed at a time when the world was corporate, and meaning there wasn't individual identity, there was communal identity. We're now trying to adopt this ancient tradition for a time of individualism. And so everybody is an imposter, and everybody is doing their best. And that should ultimately be liberating rather than intimidating, right? Everybody is in the same boat. And whatever choices we all make, we're doing our best to let this ancient tradition speak to us and to speak to humanity in an unprecedented circumstance.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's something that I struggle with, and something that I guess I see in the press as denominations or persons are struggling with this, is this idea that Judaism came from a kind of a communitarian cradle, and is now in a world that is very individually oriented. And there are people who are concerned that, it can't survive that hopping that chasm and being the same thing or as good as that thing. And what would you say to somebody who has a fear like that?
Well, look, the Talmud says that at the end of the biblical period, prophecy was removed and given only to idiots and children.
Okay. And
I am not a child, and I don't think I'm an idiot, which means nobody knows the future. So our job isn't to know what the outcome's going to be. Our job is to do the best job we can do at the moment with what's in front of us. Mm-hmm. So long as God wants there to be a Judaism, so long as God cares about the survival of Torah and the Jewish people, then that's on God's job description, not mine.
Okay.
My job is to do the best job I can do to make Judaism relevant and vibrant and wise, so that it has the best shot of continuing.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you this question about your job. What's it like being a man rabbi?
I love that question. I love that question because as recently as 100 years ago, it would have been a silly question.
Okay.
Right? Meaning the only rabbis were men. So saying a man rabbi would be like saying a Jewish rabbi. It's like, okay, that's kind of built into the concept.
Right.
And in a short time, historically speaking, we've now moved to a point where the rabbinate has broadened itself, and men and women and gay and straight and trans and bi, regardless of your gender or your orientation, if you're called to be a rabbi, you can become one. And I don't take that for granted for a moment. And as I said, with whether you're born into it or you choose it later in life, there are advantages and disadvantages in both ways. So I'm aware that because I'm a tall man, when I get up to speak, I already fit a lot of people's stereotypes of what a rabbi is supposed to look and sound like. I'm also aware that there are a lot of people who have been so wounded by the male bias of traditional life that I often have strikes against me before I've said anything. I gave a talk a couple years ago on the East Coast to a conference on inclusion. And it was all kinds of inclusion, special needs inclusion, gender inclusion, racial inclusion, all kinds. And I gave a passionate keynote talk about the importance of inclusion. At the end of my talk, a woman came up to me and said she was a local college student. And her response was, "I'm so sick of hearing heterosexual men give keynotes." It's like, okay, I can't do anything about that. Like, that is who I am. And I don't know that prejudice in one direction is any better than prejudice in another direction. So, the disadvantage of being a man who wants to be a rabbi is that there are people who pigeonhole me because of my looks or my gender or my orientation. And so it takes them a while, if ever, to really get to see the individual. And the advantage is that in most rooms, I can still walk in and I fulfill people's prior expectations about what rabbi looks and sounds like. So I think what I would offer to people who are considering the rabbinate or walking around in the world in a body is to just be mindful of both the benefits and the drawbacks of your particular situation, and then to work hard to encounter people as individuals rather than as members of a class.
Well, I think walking around with a body includes most people that I know.
Yeah.
And so I think everybody can appreciate that lesson. And I appreciate your frank and loving answer to this, because what prompted me to ask this is I felt compelled to ask one of my female colleagues a question that they're frankly sick of, or some of them are sick of. Which is, what's it like being a woman rabbi? And I said, I'll only ask you this question with the promise that I ask this to my male colleagues as well, because I think it's compelling.
In the same way that in the special needs community, more and more people insist that you use language that is people first, meaning they get upset if I talk about Jacob as my autistic son. They talk about him as my son who has autism. Right? Maybe we need to bring that into this rabbi discussion. Rabbis are not women rabbis or men rabbis. They're rabbis who are men, or rabbis who are women, or rabbis who are some other mix of the above.
Right.
But the rabbi that I am is a rabbi, right? And that's true for your friend who is also a woman, right? She's a rabbi and she's a woman.
So to put the rabbi first, as someone who's responsible for helping people to either become rabbis or be there at the threshold of when that inner rabbi emerges, as the dean of a rabbinical school, what is a rabbi, and has that changed?
So rabbi has changed a great deal from the ancient world. Rabbi always conveyed teacher, and in that sense, it hasn't changed. But what was added to that in the Jewish world was rabbi was legal decisor. So you would bring your legal cases not to a secular judge, but to a rabbi, and the rabbi would decide the law. In modern times, what has been added to that, and by modern times I mean the last 300 years, is the rabbi also became pastor and preacher.
Okay.
And so rabbis now fulfill the role that clergy fulfill in Western culture. And that's relatively new, right? So leading services, visiting the sick in the hospital, giving sermons, offering pithy quotes from the Bible or from the Talmud, being there for counseling and pastoral counseling. These are additional tasks that were not historically part of the rabbinate, but have been for a couple hundred years.
Right, which in Jewish time, I'll say in the history of rabbis, that's about 10 to 15%.
It's short, right? But that is the time we're living in,
Sure.
so it's disproportionately important.
Right.
And I'll also say that's more true the more liberal the community you're part of. Meaning, when I was a chaplain at Sloan Kettering, which is a cancer hospital in New York, if I would go into a really black hat, traditional Orthodox patient's room, they wouldn't know what to do with me, right? Because I'd say, I'm Rabbi Artson, I'm here to help you. And they would think, I don't have a chicken for you to check the lungs to tell me whether it's kosher or not. So what do I need a rabbi for?
Right.
Right. And so, again, it's a measure of the way that, look, these traditions are living things and they react to the world around them. So Jews encountered what clergy could do and they said, wow, that's good. I want one of those. And so rabbis started to act like clergy. And I think that's mostly a good thing. but it's a change from the rabbinate in the medieval period.
Mm-hmm.
And so the communities that are more open to that change are more comfortable with it, and the communities that are more resistant to that change don't really know how to handle that.
Right. And I like that because I like how you're talking about this because it kind of opens up the definition of what Judaism is in the sense that it isn't, meaning there's no sole appropriate, legitimate way of being Jewish. Different communities work on this for themselves, and they change over time, and they make decisions consciously, unconsciously, individually, corporately, in interaction with the societies that they're a part of. And so people who are less familiar with Jewish communities who say, okay, Jews are described in the Bible this way. Are these the same people walking around today? For instance, one of my rabbis back in Minnesota said he not infrequently gets phone calls from local reporters asking if we still sacrifice animals, and if so, when would be a good time to come by and see that?
Right. Yes. My favorite of those, I was a rabbi at a suburban congregation in Southern California in a town called Mission Viejo. Mm-hmm. And a newly graduated college graduate from the local community college came to see me. And his question, which he asked with all goodness of heart, was, I know what you guys were doing in the biblical period, and I know what you've done since the founding of the state of Israel, but where did you go in the meantime?
We've been on hiatus.
Exactly. We were checking out some of the highlights of Europe, Northern Africa.
Uh-huh. Very nice. It was just sort of Club Med. We were waiting for things to settle down. I had the experience of teaching in a church that was bringing in different clergy from different denominations, asking about our view of God and our view of our role in the world. And at the end of it, somebody raised their hand and said, the Hebrews that I'm familiar with through Christian teaching, or the Hebrew view of God, is very different than the loving, forgiving God that you're talking about. From your perspective of Judaism. Now, and the person asked, am I wrong about Judaism, or are you just a super liberal rabbi? And I said, well, both can be true. like, yes, I'm a super liberal rabbi, but I also learned a different version of the Jewish approach or encounter with God, or one of the many Jewish approaches encounter with God, than somebody might have heard in another context. So let me ask you this. What's the most important thing that you want people who aren't Jewish to know about Judaism and the Jewish people?
Well, that's a big order because, just as there is diversity among Jews, people who aren't Jewish are a fairly diverse and numerous group too. So on the whole, what I would like Jews and non-Jews to know about Judaism is that it's one of the great world wisdom traditions, and that it has been helping people to be resilient and compassionate and thoughtful and wise for thousands of years. So it has some distinctive perspectives to offer, but it should be part of the conversation of humanity, because it's got a lot to say and a lot of experiences. And that, having spent my adult life immersing myself in this tradition, I'm continually blown away by its wisdom and its strength and its gentleness. So in all of those ways, I just see a huge amount of benefit for people opening up to Jewish tradition, not only because in a Christian country, the roots of their own tradition are based on Jewish sources, but because in the same way that any literate person should avail themselves of streams of human culture that have something to add. Judaism does too. And the experience of the Jewish people surviving in good times and bad and continuing to make it in the world, that also has what to teach anyone about being human and about lasting.
I love that. But I want to get from the general to the specific of Judaism has a lot to offer to what's one of the most powerful things that Judaism or being a part of the Jewish people has offered to you that has changed your life.
Fair enough. So what Judaism offers to me is a single story that locates the universe, my family, me, and my future beyond my lifetime. So that there's a coherence and a meaning and a significance. Judaism offers me a loving God who cares about community and justice, so I never feel alone, and I rarely feel overwhelmed. Judaism offers a way of celebrating everyday life, celebrating once a week with a Sabbath, celebrating our children with bar and bat mitzvah, and celebrating the cycles of the year through this rich array of festivals and holidays. And then Judaism creates a powerful way to connect the generations one to another, so that we're able to love each other and have that love cascade across our history into the future through our children. So all of those things Judaism has offered to me. Plus, I love to learn. And the amount of books in Jewish tradition, the amount of wisdom that's been distilled into words is perfect for the contours of my soul.
Beautiful. I love that. And it sounds like a good way for you to live.
Yes.
I'm not going to, you don't even need me to tell you that, but you're doing a good job. And it's a way to live that's worked for me as well. So if anybody's curious about it, I recommend checking it out. I do love the volume of books thing as well, though Cara is not crazy about it at the moment.
No, no spouse of a rabbi is.
Okay. So it's not just my family where we've got more books than patients.
There's a recent alumna of our program who just posted on Facebook, how do I decide which books to get rid of? Uh-huh. I wrote in and I said, an angel dies every time you say something like that. And her spouse wrote in to say, you're not helping.
Oh, man. I always go back to the quote again, which I get no sympathy for. I think it was Rabbi David Wolpe who said, buying more books than you have time to read is how the soul reaches for infinity.
Yes.
Again, it's also how my car gets to IKEA to buy another bookshelf.
Exactly.
So I want to again go more specific when we're talking about this idea of the loving God and a perspective that some people have on God, specifically I'll just quote the sort of vengeful, wrathful God of the Hebrew Bible. Is very different from my relationship to God now. Yeah. And part of that difference is it took me about 30 years to encounter a God that I felt comfortable to believe in. Uh-huh. Right. And there's the old story. I think it's Reb Levi Yitzhak Berdichev who meets the guy who's talking about, how terrible God is. And he says, well, describe the God that you don't believe in. And then at the end says, well, I don't believe in that God either. Right. And I've heard that story mimicked in a number of other traditions as well. So one of the features of the God that I believe in, I think I got from you and your teaching while I was at the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies and the teaching that you've been sharing with the world. So I'll ask an easy question here. Who is God?
Okay. So look, I think the first thing I have to say is that anything we say about God is a reflection of our limited understanding. And that's not qualitatively different than what we say about each other. Like your description of me would be based on your experience of me, and it wouldn't fit all of me. So it's just that that's more significant when it comes to God, because there's more of God we haven't experienced in our short lifetimes and our finite intelligence. But I would say that God is the unity out of which the universe emerges. God is the mind out of which consciousness emerges. God is the impulse for thriving that we experience injustice and compassion and belonging. And God constantly invites us into relationship to be able to experience all of those things. Now, part of the challenge that you talked about, which is people who perceive the God of the Hebrew Bible as vengeful and angry, is a pretty common issue in that people read other people's scriptures critically and their own charitably.
Okay.
Right? So if you were to read the Gospels critically and not charitably, Jesus is telling people you don't offer the children's food to the dogs, by which he means taking his teaching to the Gentiles. Jesus is the one who is, calling people swine. And Paul damns most people to eternal damnation. That's harsh. The God of the Hebrew Bible never does that. I mean, a handful of people get swallowed up by earth, but you don't have most people burning in hell forever. So, but to read the Gospels that way would be a distortion. No Christian would recognize that portrayal of Jesus or God as their own. And that's true for Jews reading the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. We read it through the lens of rabbinic legends and rabbinic telling. So what we're aware of is that God does have anger at injustice or at sin. But God is always ready to forgive the sinner and is always open to tshuva, to repentance, which is the cornerstone of biblical and rabbinic religion. So I guess what I'd invite all of us to do is not read each other's scriptures with the sake of scoring points. Let's read each other's scriptures and say, how would this look if I were an adherent of this faith? What would I see in it? And what would it be saying to me? And then deal with that. And then we can ask the hard questions. Well, what do you do with that ugly passage or that uncomfortable teaching? How do you understand that? But we all have those in our traditions. There is no ancient tradition that doesn't have things that are embarrassing or difficult or ugly, because people have changed over time. So the way we mediate the divine percolates through our own humanity.
Of course. I think from a slightly different angle, I want to talk about the God that I don't believe in, if I can. And I'm just using I language rather than say, some people think this. The God that I don't believe in is the one that I wrestled with this idea of theodicy, and how could an all-powerful, all-benevolent God allow bad things to happen, whether those things are on the scale of something like the Shoah or on the personal scale of, let's say, pediatric illness. And I say that's where a lot of people hit a wall, and I guess I can only really say that's where I hit a wall.
Right, sure. So, look, the challenge is, this is something that I've thought about and written about. So I invite your listeners to go to bradartson.com, and there are some articles they can download on this subject.
Sure, and I'll put all that in the show notes here.
There's no place in the Bible where God is described as all-powerful. Right? That's a modern Western imposition. God is described as very powerful, vastly powerful, incomparably powerful, but that's not all powerful. And God can either be all good, all knowing, all powerful, any two, but not all three. It's just not logically possible. So a God who is capable of stopping the Holocaust and doesn't, either didn't know about it or is evil or couldn't stop it. And what Jewish tradition says is that God's goodness is absolute in all frames of reference. God is absolute goodness. We don't elevate power to the highest level of greatness. So we believe that God works in and with and through us, but God isn't all powerful. God doesn't violate the laws of nature. God created those laws, and once they're in place, they have their own inner determination. So I don't believe that God gave my son autism. I don't believe that God chose to let the Holocaust happen or could have stopped it. I think that God works in, with, and through my son every day to let him triumph over his autism. And I think God worked with the victims of the Shoah and with the allies, and gave us courage and strength and vision to be able to fight that fight to the end. But I don't believe in a God who is a rule breaker. I don't believe in a God whose most important trait is absolute power.
I'm breathless at this. Honestly, that's this notion that we can, God for us retains infinite or super duper goodness, perhaps infinite goodness, but not infinite power to execute that goodness. Says a couple of important things, I think, about God and about us. First, the idea that in the Jewish value system, power and might is not co-equal with good. It's not in the same category. And if it was, it wouldn't match in value.
That's right.
Right. And I think the idea, what we also learned from this is this notion that God can be infinitely good, but only as powerful as God's agents, only as powerful as God can inspire us to act. That's the limit of the power, which, puts some responsibility on us, but also gives us a pretty important job to do. Yeah.
Right, it does. So that's really our opportunity, is to the extent that we are to be like God, we are called to emphasize our goodness and not our coercive power.
Huh.
I think that's where the Western world chose to be more like imperial Rome than like wise Israel. And they're not the same path, and you can't do both.
Right. You can either be strong.
You're defining strength in terms of capacity to coerce.
Okay.
And that's a particular kind of strength, but not a very useful one when what you want to do is influence someone. Think about in your own life, the people who've had the greatest positive impact on you, they weren't the people who had the power to coerce you. They were the people who had the willingness to inspire you.
That's so true. That's so true. I remember, I don't know if this is of the same ilk or at the same level, but I remember the teaching in rabbinical school where you encouraged us to use the SeaWorld trainer mode of leadership. If I may, and you'll correct me if I get this wrong, but how do trainers of large mammals get the large mammal to do the thing that either they want them to do or is best for them? And the answer is only positive reinforcement.
That's exactly right. You're right. And that's true, but that works for people too.
Yeah.
Right. And so why wouldn't God, who is the ultimate source of love and meaning in the universe, also operate through influence, through love, through suggestion, through invitation, right? The idea that God is all-powerful is a Greek philosophical notion that was meant to explain ancient physics, but it's no longer necessary, and it was never Jewish.
Right. Yeah, and in all the passages in all the passages that we have that are of the imitatio Dei genre, be like God. God does this, and you should be like God. Those are things like be just, be kind, but never be. It never says be boss. Right.
No. High Holiday is what God says to Moses when Moses says, "Pass before me and tell me who you are." God is El Rahum V'Chanun Erech Apayim V'Rav Chesed. God is merciful and compassionate and full of patience. Those are moral qualities. Those are not coercive qualities.
Right. It's not I'm 800 feet tall and can bench press Jupiter.
We're mistaking God and King Kong.
I'll try not to make that mistake anymore if I can avoid it. The penultimate question, or I'll say the third to last question, third to last question. Why be Jewish?
Oh, I have an idiosyncratic answer for that.
I'm counting on it.
So here's the thing. You should be Jewish if your soul thirsts to be Jewish. And that's the only reason. Don't do it because God will love you more, because God won't. Mm-hmm. Don't do it because it makes your life easier or better. It can, but it also brings its own challenges.
To be sure.
There are lots of great ways to be Jewish. So the only good reason to be Jewish is if you are drawn to being Jewish. And then if you're drawn to being Jewish, either because you were born that way or because you look over and you say, wow, that's where my soul would be at home, then join in. But otherwise, don't.
Is there something that you would want converts to know, or people who are, I talked to a lot of people who are considering converting to Judaism. Is there something that you would want them to know either right before they convert, just to make sure they understand it, or maybe right after as, kind of some rabbinic advice as to how to approach this new thing that they're doing?
Well, I think someone needs to tell people towards the beginning of their considering conversion that there are some truly, truly lovely, wonderful people who are Jewish, and there are some extraordinary jerks.
Okay.
So they should not become Jewish because all Jews are sweetness and light.
You're not talking about me, are you?
Let's discuss that in private later.
Fair enough.
So I would want to disabuse them of that. And the second thing I would want to say is that once they convert, they are as Jewish as a 10th generation rabbi, and not to let anyone else take that away from them.
That's beautiful. What's something that you're working on right now that you would like the Jewcurious people to know about?
Well, partly I alluded to it. I've been working on a theology that's called process theology that sees the world as dynamic and interactive and in relationship. And I wrote a book introducing that called God of Becoming and Relationship. And then I wrote what I hope is the beginning of a trilogy. I wrote a book looking at called Renewing the Process of Creation that looks at science and religion. Mm-hmm. Now I want to do a book on revelation. What does it mean to understand God giving us the Torah, not as this up there, out there entity that drops a book on our head, but rather as the relatedness of the universe bubbling up within us as stories and as wisdom? And how does that help us to understand Scripture better and to connect it to God better? So that's the book I'd like to start working on pretty soon.
Gotcha. So the book that's out is the first part of that trilogy.
Correct. So I have the introductory book, God of Becoming and Relationship. And then I have the first part of the trilogy, which is Renewing the Process of Creation.
Okay, fantastic. So I'll put the book that's out in the show notes so that people can grab that. And sure. What is the best way for people to get in touch with you if they want to learn more about you or with you?
They can go to my public figure Facebook page, www.facebook.com/ or whatever that thing is.
Right. Rabbi Artson. Okay, I'll put a link to that as well. Rabbi Artson, always a pleasure learning with you. Always a pleasure joking with you, telling dad stories with you, and I sit at your feet, and I'm really grateful to share not only this time with you, but to share your Torah with the people listening to this podcast. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rabbi Carrier. My pleasure.
Hero, thank you so much for listening to today's episode. If you want to know more about Rabbi Artson and all the resources and things that we mentioned today, I want you to check out the show notes, and that can be found at jewcurious.show/episode 5. That's the numeral 5. Go to that link and you'll find a list of books that Rabbi Artson has shared, a link to his website, a link to an article about Tefillin so that you could see what we were talking about in that story in the beginning. And there's also a couple of links on there that I want to mention. The first is an event that is coming up here in Burbank. If you are within sensible driving distance of Burbank, I highly recommend that you check this out. This is a forum that's being put on by the Burbank Human Relations Council. They're calling it the Burbank Interfaith Forum. And the program is a Christian, a Jew, and a Muslim in conversation. And spoiler alert, I'm the Jew. So I'm there with a Christian priest. I'm there with a Muslim community leader. And we're going to have a frank and open conversation in front of about 100 people, followed by dinner. So if you don't like religious interfaith dialogue, but you do like dinner, there's something for everybody. So there's a link to that in the show notes. That's on July 29th. I'd love to see you there. And finally, there is one more link, and that's to download a special resource that I prepared for you today in honor of my conversation with Rabbi Artson. And that's a checklist of 5 limiting beliefs people have about Judaism and how to overcome them. What's holding you back from having a better understanding of Judaism, or holding you back from having a more joyful experience in the Jewish community yourself? You may be holding on to one of these 5 limiting beliefs, but if you download this resource, we can learn together and grow together so that you can get more out of Judaism and really more out of your life. So check out the show notes, learn more about Rabbi Artson, and finally click on this link to download the 5 limiting beliefs people have about Judaism and how you can overcome them. Hero, thanks again for listening to this show. Proud as always to share my guests with you. Grateful as always to learn with you. And until next time, peace.
Thanks for listening to the Jewcurious Show at www.jewcurious.show.